The Atlanta Hawks are a mess. After a fantastic season last year, making it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, so far early on into this year, the Hawks have a 17-25 record and are currently the 12th seed in the Eastern Conference. But quickly before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports. I make opinionative NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, please consider hitting that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. But anyways, let's get into it.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetics.
I think the Atlanta Hawks built their organization the exact right way. The first thing they did was obviously rebuild their team and build through the draft, and once they actually got a pretty nice young core, then they actually went into free agency and started to sign some players. But I think oftentimes what happens when a team or organization decides they need to rebuild is maybe they rebuild for 2 or so seasons, but the players that they get in those drafts aren't necessarily franchise pieces and they go into free agency way too early, which is just the complete wrong approach. And in my opinion, if you do so, it could really push your organization back a few seasons and maybe you would have to go into another rebuild. But I just think the Hawks did it the exact right way, and I think we saw the success last year when they made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals when a lot of people didn't even think they would get past the first round in the playoffs. But after that fantastic season they had last year, so far early on into this year, they really have struggled. As I mentioned before, they are the 12th seed in the Eastern Conference, and when you actually look at their offensive efficiency and their defensive efficiency, they're struggling offensively. They're still a decent offensive team, but they're not nearly as efficient as they were last year. And defensively, they're just a complete mess. They're terrible defensively, when last year they were actually a pretty good defensive team. Now, how does this even happen? How does a team go from last year just having success on both ends to this year them struggling on both ends pretty significantly? Now, this is due to a bunch of different factors, but just quickly talking about their offensive issues, the main reason is because of injuries / health and safety protocols, in my opinion. Maybe there is a little bit of a regression from last year, but mostly I think it's due to those two reasons. You talk about a guy like Trae Young, who's been out a little bit here and there with health and safety protocols, which basically everybody in the league has had to go through at this point, but certainly that's going to take a big hit to your offense, as well as some other guys have been out with health and safety protocols. You talk about a guy like DeAndre Hunter, who's a pretty big part of this Hawks offense. He's been out for a little bit of time at this point, and I think all these injuries / health and safety protocols are a big reason why the Hawks are struggling early on into this season, at least offensively, but of course it's not the only reason why. I think there certainly has been a little bit of a regression. Some players are just not hitting the same shots as they were hitting last year, and I think that's a major reason for why the Hawks are struggling a little bit more offensively. But talking about their defensive issues, I think it's somewhat of the same issue where they've been having a lot of injuries. Of course, a guy like DeAndre Hunter is also a really good defender and he helps him out significantly on that side, but also a guy like Clint Capella, who's been a major part of their defense, has been out for a little bit of time as well, and when he's out of the lineup, the Hawks really do struggle defensively. I think we even saw that a little bit last year, but this season we've really seen it. He completely changes their defense. The reason why is a lot of players, at least perimeter players on the Hawks, aren't necessarily great defenders, and a lot of times the offensive player would blow right by them. But when you have Clint in the paint, who's such a fantastic anchor to have on the back line of your defense, I think he did a great job at either blocking the person's shot or maybe just getting a good contest on it, and he really helped their defense overall, because the Hawks players, at least their perimeter players, knew even if the offensive player blew by them, it didn't necessarily matter because they had such a defensive anchor in Clint Capella in the paint, and he just did such a great job. But now the fact that they don't have Clint Capella in the lineup, at least right now, I think the Hawks are really struggling a lot defensively. But now the real question is, do I personally think the Hawks are going to be a good team overall, or do I think the season is going to be a wash? Now, I personally think this Hawks team is very talented, and I can easily see them getting back to, at the very least, a top 6 seed in the Eastern Conference. When you look at some of the players they have on their team, of course, Trae Young, Clint Capella, Kevin Huerter, DeAndre Hunter, Bogdanovich, they have so many very talented players on their team. And for a team this talented to not at the very least be a top 6 seed, in my opinion, I would see the season as a humongous failure. But in my opinion, I certainly do think they could start to figure it out. But to really turn their season around, they're going to need to do a few different things. So of course, the first thing is everybody needs to get healthy, get out of health and safety protocols. Whatever players are injured, just get back on the court and start to really build a chemistry with all the players healthy for a decent amount of time. If they can do that, I think this team is going going to eventually regain the chemistry that they had last year and eventually turn into somewhat of the team they had last year. I don't think they're going to be as good as they were. I think last year was a fantastic year for them, but at the same time, I do think this team is very talented and has the ability to become a top 6 seed, as I mentioned. And a real key thing for this Hawks team is if everybody does get back in the court and everybody starts to feel comfortable, their chemistry starts flowing again, they're playing very good offense in terms of a fantastic pick and roll with Trae Young and John Collins / pick and pop, or maybe a pick and roll with Trae and Clint Capella just breaking down the defense, kicking it out to one of his wide open shooters for easy catch and shoot 3-point shots, Trae just dominating like he normally does. If they can do all those things effectively, I don't see a reason why the Hawks wouldn't at the very least be able to make it back to the playoffs, and if they were to do so, depending on who they play, obviously, I don't see a reason why they wouldn't be able to make it an interesting series and maybe even win their first round playoff matchup. I think the Hawks have a very good chance to win a first round playoff series against a lot of teams in the Eastern Conference. The only teams that I think would be a very, very difficult matchup for the Hawks and would certainly favor the opposing team would be the Bucks, Nets, and Bulls. I think those 3 teams are kind of the juggernauts in the Eastern Conference, and basically nobody else in the Eastern Conference could beat those teams besides themselves. But I think out of the rest of the teams, I think the Hawks are certainly the most talented and would have a pretty decent shot against a lot of other teams they play. But obviously, if they're a 6th seed or lower in the Eastern Conference, they're probably going to have to play one of those 3 teams that I mentioned. And in that playoff matchup, they could probably win a few games, maybe 2 games, maybe 3 games, but probably the other teams would win that playoff matchup. I think a matchup between maybe the Heat and Hawks would definitely be a very difficult matchup for the Hawks as well, although I could see them winning that playoff matchup. In my opinion, I think they're very talented and have the ability to do so, but we'll see what happens going forward for the Hawks this season. But one thing that I also want to mention is a lot of players on the court that the Hawks have right now are getting paid pretty handsome contracts, and the issue with that going forward is if these core of guys don't play well together long term, and maybe last season was just a fluke, it's going to be very difficult for the Hawks to move on from some of these guys. When you talk about John Collins, of course Trae Young, who got paid a max contract and deserves it, Kevin Huerter, Bogdanovich, Clint Capella, Gallinari has a pretty decent contract. There's a bunch of guys on this Hawks team that are getting paid a lot, and if for whatever reason this team doesn't work out together, it's going to be difficult for the Hawks to move on from some of these guys. And what I mean by that is if these guys aren't playing well and they have a pretty big contract, it's going to be hard to move on for them, obviously by trading them, but also it's going to be very difficult for the Hawks to bring in guys during free agency because they're not going to have enough money, obviously. So it kind of puts the Hawks in a weird position and a pretty bad position going forward if they're not able to improve and really do anything going forward. If the Hawks turn into a team that's maybe like a 6th or 7th seed going forward for the next few seasons, that's going to be a terrible situation because obviously, as I mentioned, they have no money and no real route to get better unless they draft very well, but they're also probably not going to have a high draft pick, so it's going to be very difficult in that sense as well. They're just going to be in a very bad situation, and a situation you really don't want to be in, which is being very mediocre. I personally don't think the Hawks are going in that direction, but I just wanted to throw it out there as a possibility. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Hawks are going in a bad direction, or do you think they're going to figure it out by the end of the year? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetic. Hope you can't go